Welcome everyone. Thanks again for joining us. We're going to start in just a few moments. I see some folks introducing themselves in the chat box, so thanks for that. All right, good afternoon everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. Very warm welcome to you all from a beautiful sunny day in Chicago. The light's going to hit me in just a couple minutes, but it is my pleasure to welcome you to our webinar, Confronting Bias and Building Trust, Strategies to Create Inclusive Environments for Black Teachers. This webinar is hosted by Regional Educational Laboratory, or REL Midwest, at the American Institutes for Research. So both the slides and the recording from this webinar will be made available online. You can access them by following the links that Emily is going to post in the chat box. And as such, today's webinar will be recorded. So as participants, we want to provide you with this notice. The American Institutes for Research, or AIR, allows for the recording of audio, visuals, participants, and other information sent, verbalized, or utilized during business-related meetings. By joining a meeting, you automatically consent to such recordings. Any participant who prefers to participate via audio only should disable their video camera, so only their audio will be captured. And video and/or audio recordings of any AIR session shall not be transmitted to an external third party without the permission of AIR. All right, so for this webinar, as you probably noticed, we're using Zoom. The audio options are located on the left-hand side of your toolbar as indicated by the headphone icon. And we're going to be inviting you to participate using the chat box, which you can find by selecting the speech bubble icon kind of in the middle right of your toolbar. And closed captioning is available. So if you would like to access that, please select the icon to the far right-hand side of the toolbar. We do have a full agenda today, so beginning with a welcome and overview, followed by short presentations by both researchers and practitioners. We're then going to invite our panelists to engage in a discussion and close with a few remarks. And we can move right along, Sarah. So my name is Kyle Fagan, and I'm a researcher with REL Midwest, and I'm going to be co-moderating today's webinar with my colleague, Dr. Jamila Conway-Turner. Sarah Matrano, Sarah Rand, and Emily Loney from REL Midwest are also supporting us today. They're going to be providing links in the chat box, and please do reach out to them if you're experiencing any technical issues. We are excited to be joined today by Dr. Curtis Jones and Dr. Marlo Reeves from the Office of Socially Responsible Evaluation and Education, and Katie Rainey, the Director of Educator Development and Support at the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction. We are also joined today by Kyron Harville, STAR Project Director at the Lansing School District, and Sharif Elmeki, the CEO of the Center for Black Educator Development. And we're excited to have such a smart, thoughtful, and energized group of presenters today. As I mentioned, this webinar is hosted by REL Midwest, and REL Midwest serves 7 states in the Midwest region and is one of the 10 RELs across the country. We conduct applied research, provide technical support, and offer engagement activities, such as this webinar, to help partners make sense of and use research to improve student outcomes. And I'm now going to invite Jamila on to talk more about our work and the research base behind today's webinar. So Jamila.
Thanks, Kyle. So as Kyle said, this webinar is brought to you from REL Midwest, and Kyle and I co-lead the Midwest Achievement Gap Research Alliance, also known as MAGRA. And through that work, we work to increase the educational outcomes among Black students in the Midwest region, specifically in Wisconsin, but we also have a lot of projects in the other Midwest states as well. So we've done a lot of work, and these are just a sample of some of the projects that we have done. And Emily has put the links in the chat box that will help guide you to where these resources are. But we've developed a literature review and a couple of videos all highlighting practices that can help improve the educational outcomes among Black students. So we know that there are a lot of people on this webinar today. We're really happy that you were able to join us. We'd love to know a little bit more about your role. So we've launched this poll. If you could select your role here so we can see the diversity of everyone on this webinar, go ahead and click to select your role and then hit submit. And then we can go ahead and see those results. So it looks like we have quite a variety here today, including some school and district central office staff, some state level education administrators, also folks from public policy organizations and researchers as well. Welcome to all of you. We hope that this is informative in your work. So we know that a lot of you are coming with your own knowledge and experience here on this topic. We'd love for you to just take a moment to go ahead and write in the chat box just how you might describe an inclusive environment for Black teachers. We'll refer to this information throughout the webinar today. We have a lot of experts on this webinar, but we know that you have expertise as well. So we'd love to see your thoughts. Go to the next slide, Sarah. So just as a little bit of background on the research behind this webinar today, we know that Black teachers play a really important role in student outcomes, and research has shown that Black teachers really improve the student educational outcomes, including increasing academic performance, graduation rates, post-secondary aspirations, and reducing disciplinary issues. And although we know that Black teachers are really important, we also know that there are barriers to retaining Black teachers in the education field, and that Black teachers are more likely to move schools or leave the teaching profession. And there's a variety of reasons for that that we'll talk about today during this webinar. So now I'd like to invite Curtis, Katie, and Marlo up to talk about the research behind this presentation.
Thank you, Jamila. This is Curtis Jones from University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee with my colleagues Catherine Rainey and Dr. Marlo Reeves. And first of all, we'd just like to thank Jamila and Kyle and the folks at AIR for inviting us to talk with you all today about this research and this really important topic. Both of the studies that we're going to talk about today are part of a research practice partnership we have with DPI and with UW-Madison. And they're also part of the Wisconsin Educator Effectiveness Research, Educator Effectiveness Evaluation that we've been working with DPI with for about 8 years now or so, give or take 1 or 2. So the first study that we're talking about today is we looked at the retention of Black, Latinx, and white teachers from 2017 to 2019 statewide across Wisconsin. And we also followed novice teachers who entered Wisconsin public education in 2013. We followed them through 2019 to see who was retained in their school and in public education. And the reason we were doing this is there's a lot of discussion around diversifying the education workforce and a lot of focus that's been on finding ways of increasing the pipeline, especially for diverse educators. But it is our belief that, that a lot more needs to be understood about why we have so few educators of color in Wisconsin and elsewhere before we can really understand how to best diversify the education workforce. So the first thing we looked at was what you call the diversity gap between students and teachers in Wisconsin, and it's large. So you have 69% of students that are white, or 31% who are students of color, and you have almost all teachers, 95% who are white. And the gap is getting wider in the last 10 years. The percentage of students of color has increased by 50% in Wisconsin, while the percentage of teachers of color has, has seen very little change. Focusing on Black students, few Black students in Wisconsin are provided the opportunity of being taught by a Black educator, which we know from previous research is really important for their achievement and success. And only 2% of all Wisconsin teachers are Black, compared to 9% of students, but that's a little misleading because 71% of all Black educators are in the Milwaukee Public Schools. So outside of MPS, only 0.6% of teachers are Black, compared to 4.5% of students, and 86% of all Wisconsin schools have no Black teachers. Looking at teacher retention across all teachers from 2017 to 2019, Black teachers were much more likely to leave their school and even public education than what we found for was the case for white teachers. Nearly half, or 42%, of all Black teachers had changed schools or left public education within just 2 years. When we examine the retention of new or novice teachers, which as a group are already at risk of not continuing in public education, what we found was that nearly half of all new Black teachers who started their public education career in 2013-14 school year had not just left their school, had left public education in Wisconsin after just 2 years of being a teacher. So 48% of all new Black teachers had left Wisconsin public education after just 2 years. So what this really suggested to us is that we really need to understand what is happening during these first 2 years that is leading half of new Black educators to leave public education. And because of this, it might not make sense to increase the pipeline for Black educators if it means more Black educators will be subjected to the same processes that result in so many leaving public education. So what we did was we conducted surveys of educators across all Wisconsin in 2017. These surveys asked teachers about the trust that they felt with teachers in their school. When we compared the feelings of trust reported by Black, white, and Latinx teachers and related that to their employment in 2019. Related to the lower retention of Black educators, we found that there are serious intercultural communication challenges or interracial communication challenges that negatively and disproportionately affect the professional experiences of Black educators. These manifest as lower relational trust experienced by Black educators. Regardless of whether a Black teacher stayed or left their school, they reported much lower trust between educators in their school than did white teachers. So a Black educator that stayed in their school had lower relational trust than a white educator who left their school. This was found across schools and within schools. So if you asked a Black educator, who in many cases is the only Black educator in their school, that person will likely report much lower feelings of trust with other teachers in their school than asking a white teacher in that same school would. So following through to 2019, looking at what happened after 2 years of being a teacher, the trust between educators largely determined if the educator stayed or left their school. Teachers who reported higher trust between educators were more likely to stay. That's probably not surprising. And in fact, a Black teacher who felt the highest level of relational trust were more likely to stay, but the higher they got, they started to converge on the same retention rates as Latinx or white educators. So when it was really high trust reported by the individuals, retention was high across all groups. In our second study that my colleague, Dr. Marlo Reeves, will present, we expanded our analysis of the professional culture in schools beyond trust. Look at the things that build off of trust, like teacher collaboration, teacher commitment to their school, attitudes towards the educator effectiveness system. This study included 211 schools and followed them from 2017 to 2019. During this time, we used teacher surveys to compare the strength of professional culture in schools serving Black, Latinx, and white students. During this time, 73% of all teachers completed surveys, which is more than 15,000 completed surveys across all 3 years. We then examined the impact that the strength of the school's professional culture has on schools' change and the achievement of Black, white, and Latinx students. No.
Thanks, Curtis. As he was saying, for the second study, we looked into the many elements of the school's professional culture, particularly those related to teacher satisfaction, commitment, retention, and trust. We gave special attention to the ways race, racism, and anti-Blackness shape the data. And most importantly, we looked at how and in what ways do young people of color, how are they influenced by schools' professional culture? While looking at the professional data, we wanted to develop ways of describing schools with thriving professional environments versus looking at those looking to improve. As you see in the previous slide with the chart, schools with thriving professional culture are seen as organized to improve with high teacher satisfaction, high teacher commitment, trust in their principal, as well as trust in their principal's feedback. Thinking back to the study that Dr. Jones was talking about a second ago, we know that Black teachers are often not teaching in schools seen as organized to improve. Here, we considered the ways that professional culture, race, racism, and anti-Blackness affect students. This work shows that although only a quarter of schools serving white students in Wisconsin that were in the study are organized to improve, their achievement scores continue to be better than the Wisconsin state average. Only about 10% of schools in the work that are serving Black and Latinx students were considered to be organized to improve. And they were able to raise achievement scores over time. In the schools not organized to improve, the achievement scores were either maintained or below average. And those are also schools that are serving predominantly students of color, Black and Latinx students. I'll end my piece with just a few questions on that data. You know, what does it mean to know that our young people and the likelihood of them succeeding in schools is so deeply tied into the ways that we see and treat teachers? We say we want to include and make inclusive environments for Black teachers. How are we defining inclusive? In what ways do our efforts both humanize and support Black teachers, especially teachers that are within predominantly Black and Latinx schools or schools with predominantly Black and Latinx students, right? How are we supporting and humanizing their efforts in themselves? If teachers of color are pushed out and Black students are marginalized and achievement is racialized, what does it mean for states, districts, and educators, researchers, for those issues to continue to go unaddressed? Katie?
Well, I think I'm going to take this last slide and then Katie's after that. So just wanted to kind of tie some things together. Then Katie Rainey is going to talk a bit about some of the work that she's doing to act on the results that we presented here. You know, the main thing that that kind of came from this work was that there's these serious problems and challenges of educators working together across races. You know, and it's likely related to bias and other factors. And there's a lot that's been done to provide educators training around bias and implicit bias and around their interactions with students and families. And what we're showing is that it's at least as important that educators across racial groups get that same training, that there's that schools are organized to in an anti-racist way. And what this study also shows is the potential payoff of doing that well. We found really large achievement gap reduction in schools that had developed a strong professional culture that served Black and Latinx students. In some cases, the achievement gap was completely reduced. So it's about the students, and if we can find ways to create inclusive environments for Black educators and allow that the cohesion to occur within a school and the professional culture, then students will benefit to a great extent. Katie?
Yeah, so I just wanted to offer a few things that we are going to be doing based off of these findings. And first is just to continue this evaluation work. One of the things that I don't know if it was clear at the beginning is that we didn't seek out to study this particular study. We were actually evaluating the impact of our educator effectiveness system and found in the data things that were standing out and decided to that it was important to look into it. So the first commitment is continuing to fund and support support this evaluation work with Marlo and Curtis to be able to continue to learn and inform not just the work of my team, but also the work of the state agency, because obviously this has impact well beyond the work of my team. Second, we've also found that through the study, we know that schools that are organized to improve, which does include aspects of the educator effectiveness system, do have impact on closing achievement gaps, but we want to be even more explicit about that and even more effective. And so one of the things that we've learned is that for people that are coming with an equity lens or an anti-racist lens, they see equity in the educator effectiveness professional development system. They infuse it throughout and they see how it's already built in. For those that maybe haven't been as trained or have as strong of a foundation in equity or anti-racism, it's not there to them. So we wanted to make changes to our system to be more explicit about equity. And as Curtis mentioned from the findings of the study, that includes focusing on self, focusing on interactions with students, but also focusing on interactions with other educators. So we'll be building that into our processes. We'll be revising the self-review process to not just review and reflect on our practices, but also on ourself, our identity and our biases and how that impacts how we show up in our practices. We'll also be building in prompts that, that focus on setting goals with an equitable lens, and then to have that inform ongoing learning to change our practice to be more equitable. The goals will also be much more rigorous. We're no longer going to be allowing educators to set goals that are ambitious but achievable, and instead we'll be requiring all educators to set goals that move students to grade level or above. And we'll be coaching observers, coaches, and evaluators to focus specifically on observing for practices and coaching for practices with an equity lens. As part of these changes, we're going to be convening a statewide training for all school teams. And in that, we want to leverage that opportunity. So we'll be infusing a foundational equity training for all school teams, which I believe is the first time we're doing a statewide training focused on equity. And then in that, we'll be going deeper into the educator effectiveness system. In that, we'll be coaching and training people to specifically coach for equity and practices around equity. And then finally, we'll be linking all of this work to a streamlined HR process where from day one, you're looking to hire anti-racist teachers. And we're actually learning from one of our fellow panelists using some of the resources that he has created to inform that work. Thank you.
Oh, I was muted, sorry. Thanks so much, Katie, Curtis, and Marlo. That was a great presentation on the research. We just have a couple minutes for questions, and I'll go ahead and ask a couple that have come up. We will have a panel discussion at the end, so we'll have more time for questions. This is just for kind of quick clarifying questions now. But there was one question that came up on study one, that one of the participants noticed that the retention numbers went up after year 2 and was wondering if you had ideas for what factors contributed to that.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and something we also noticed that over time, specifically the retention for Black and Latinx teachers did improve after the second year. And you know, it's only anecdotal evidence at this point for why that might be, but it seemed like there was more of a push to get out of the school that they were currently in. And that, you know, they weren't necessarily done with being a school teacher as much as they were done being a school teacher in the specific school that they're in. So once they had some distance from that school, then they were able to re-enter the workforce and maybe find a school that was a better fit for them for whatever they were looking for.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. Well, thank you all so much. We don't have too much time, so I think we're going to go ahead and move on, but we will have more time for questions later, and we'll see you all for the panel discussion shortly. And I want to remind all of the participants that you can ask your questions in the chat box as we're going through, and to go ahead and select the all panelists and attendees before you ask the question, and that way everyone can see your question and we can respond. And then we'll have a chance to get your question out there. So, Kyron, thank you for coming on, and we're excited to hear your presentation.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. I would like to thank REL for having me, as well as Mrs. Betty Underwood for recommending me to this organization. My name is Kyron Harvell. I'm here on behalf of the Lansing School District in Lansing, Michigan. So a little of my story. I've worked in the district for the last 16 years in the capacity as a principal at the elementary, middle, and high school level, as well as a guidance counselor. Interestingly enough, as I thought about it, over those 16 years, I've been in probably 7 different buildings, and I've only had 9 Black teachers total in 16 years. It made me think about my experience in college, where I didn't have any professors that were Black until I got to my graduate school. I ran into my mentor, Dr. Robbie Stewart, who ended up becoming like a second mom to me. So it just kind of made me reflect on the experience of not seeing anyone that looks like you in school. So currently, I'm the director of the STAR grant. This is a school culture and transformation grant from the federal government. It's a 5-year grant. STAR stands for School Transformation Accelerates Results. This is a 5-year grant with an emphasis on providing equitable access to opportunities for all key stakeholders through focusing on culture responsive practices, professional development, social emotional learning, mental health, decreasing office referrals and out-of-school suspensions, and providing multi-tiered system of support. Interestingly enough, that last statement in terms of referrals and suspensions, when we look at the demographics of Lansing School District, 39% of the students are African American. However, those 39% during 2019-2020 made up 81% of the out-of-school suspensions and 77% of the disciplinary referrals. So to start to ask the question of, is this an issue of staff not having relationships with students? Because when we look at the staff demographic, it does not reflect the student demographic. In Lansing, similar to other areas, I would say the staff demographic is 90% white, majority being females, and clearly here you can see the breakdown of the demographics for the students. My background is in counseling, and all the research supports the notion that rapport is the strongest indicator of successful outcomes between a client and therapist or a teacher and student. So this kind of pushes the issue of how important it is to have relationships. So I've often wondered, are some of the reasons that we see such high discipline referrals and out-of-school suspensions due to there being that disconnect between staff and students? I was very fortunate to be selected for the Aspiring Leaders Program. Mrs. Underwood is director of the REAP program, another federal grant. REAP stands for Rewarding Educator Achievement Performance. I was on the central office track where I had the opportunity to rotate through various departments. One of my major interests, and the department I couldn't wait to get to, was the Human Resource Department. I was very interested in understanding the recruitment efforts as it relates to Black teachers. Nationwide, Black males only make up 2% of the teachers in the nation. I saw Mrs. Unae holding this online, and I was reminded of when we went to a recruiting fair in Atlanta, and I was kind of going around bugging everyone. I thank her for putting up with me, and I was trying to convince people to come to Lansing, and they were saying, it's too cold there, it snows there. I said, well, we'll provide you with a coat, boots, just come to Lansing, come work with us, and I'll do whatever I could. So during this program, my capstone project, I want to look at recruitment efforts. I interviewed teachers, sent surveys in the district, as well as teachers at historically Black college universities, as well as other colleges. So look at recruitment. Why did teachers get into the field? What's their experience been since they've been in the field? And why do they feel Black teachers do not want to come to education? Overwhelmingly, all the responses were pretty much the same. In terms of why teachers got into the field, they felt that need to get back to their community. Similar to me, they grew up not really having any teachers that looked like them. So they wanted to be of benefit to those, be that voice for the voiceless. In terms of their experience, it was really interesting, very sad. Many mentioned that they often didn't feel included or a part of the team. They didn't feel that level of cohesion that staff should feel. They often felt that there weren't many opportunities for upward mobility and advancement. They also indicated that they were often sent to low performing schools, schools on the persistently low achieving list, or they were given the kids who had the most discipline problems or issues related to academics, which of course negatively impacted their evaluation, stress level, et cetera. Also, they had to be quote unquote the Black voice whenever something would come up, and they often felt isolated in staff meetings. This was across the board, district-wide, when I talked to other college universities, as well as historically Black college universities. When asked why individuals were not coming into the field, one of the main things came up was the financial aspect in terms of starting salary, all the changes that take place in education, being concerned about going to a quote unquote bad school, not having mentorship, being worried about being that one person that has to be the sole voice for Black students, and also the incentives that are not currently in place at many districts. So those are some of the issues that came up from the findings during my capstone project in the Aspiring Leaders Program. I was happy to become the director of the STAR grant because I'm really big on culturally responsive practices. One of the things we've done and continue to do, which started this summer, was provide a professional development series. We had weekly webinars every Wednesday, and I invited scholars, both locally and nationally, to come in and talk about topics, from Dr. Dorinda Carter-Andrews to Dr. Anthony Muhammad. They talked about looking at culture and climate through an equity lens, strategies to work effectively with all populations, code shifting, dealing with your urban students in the age of COVID-19, school to prison pipeline, et cetera. And as a result of these professional development series, staff were able to come together. They started their own book studies. A lot of staff had the opportunity to reflect on their own personal practices. We had professional development sessions on implicit bias. Many staff were able to take a look at themselves and say, wow, I didn't realize that I had this bias. I didn't realize I was doing this. So staff have been really involved in focusing on being more culturally responsive, utilizing planning time to be culturally responsive, and just think about their social practice. We're very fortunate in Lansing School District to have a collaboration with our Human Resources Department and the Office of School Culture and Climate as it relates to our employee wellness program. I just found out we're starting a STEP program to assist individuals getting healthy. There's mental health counseling. We're in collaboration with the organization to provide mental health counseling. Staff can come in and get massages. Staff have mileage clubs. Staff can get other resources that can assist them as far as making sure they're able to deal with the stress and strain of being a teacher, not just during COVID, but just being a teacher and being responsible for the lives of our children. So our employee wellness program is really taking off right now, and I've heard from many staff that they greatly appreciate it. I saw Mrs. Rusher, Doretha Rusher's on the line as well. She and Elizabeth Ballinger are starting a self-care series each week. They're going to have a webinar where they talk with staff about self-care strategies. So again, I think we're doing an excellent job in Lansing regarding our employee wellness program. So lessons learned. In terms of the surveys and interviews, I think the biggest lesson that I learned is we have to be very strategic in terms of how we go about recruiting Black teachers to districts. We need to really look at what their needs are. We need to have an open ear and recognize that as long as people feel isolated and marginalized, they're not going to want to become a part of any organization. I believe statistically, over half the students in public schools are students of color. However, we know, as I mentioned earlier, the staff demographic does not reflect this when you're looking at students. It's hard to be something that you can't see. It's very important that our students are able to see people that look like them. That's a very big deal. Safe environments for equity discussions. We've had a lot of staff that have said, they wish they could have these conversations on a more frequent basis. So now in Lansing School District, I was happy to see that our central office implemented what's called A Day. It's an asynchronous learning day where staff have the opportunity to work on social emotional learning. They can have these discussions related to equity, related to how we go about providing structural practices and just support for staff and students. In terms of next steps, I would encourage districts to look at conducting a comprehensive needs assessment to really talk with staff of color to find out what's going on, what's been their experience, why they get into the field, and why do they feel others are not coming. If we don't talk directly to the people, we can make all the assumptions that we want, but the answer lies with those that are engaged in the work. Recruitment and retention incentives. I have a friend who recently went to Los Angeles and the LA Unified Schools. Anyone that comes there to teach, they're offering them free housing. Looking at things such as providing housing, even providing transportation, tuition reimbursement, maybe a stipend for teaching in some of the persistently low achieving or priority schools may be a benefit to bring in more Black teachers. Grow your own programs, such as the Aspiring Leaders Program, which I had the pleasure in taking in. As I mentioned during the interviews and surveys, many staff indicated that they didn't feel there was any room for upper mobility and they were just kind of stuck. We will start to see more people that want to come in when they recognize there's opportunities to grow and develop and to not just stay in one place. And lastly, equity audits, which our school district recently sent out a request for proposals. We're going to have a firm come in and conduct an equity audit to look at how funding is allocated, to look at staffing, to look at hiring processes, and to get just to gauge teachers to see how they feel things are going in the Lansing School District.
Thanks so much, Kyron. That was a really great overview of your work and your program. We have one quick question for you from the panelists. They were wondering how you set up your professional development regarding culture responsiveness, and if you feel like there was any PD fatigue as a result that may have let less people want to participate.
So the way I set up my professional development, I reached out to quite a few staff to conduct a survey to see what areas of need they would like to hear professional development or have some training on. After getting those topics together, I started to reach out to friends that I know that are well respected, both locally and nationally, to see if they would be willing to provide professional development. They gladly welcomed the opportunity. I didn't see much fatigue. We probably averaged during the summer close to 200 participants per session, which I think is good considering that teachers are technically off work. Well, teachers are always working, but they're not contractually scheduled to work during the summer. We averaged about 200 participants. It was every Wednesday from June until September from 1 to 2:30. So I don't feel that there was any fatigue. The presentation was very engaging. The presenters provided their PowerPoint. They provided book recommendations. When I was on there, I would always give a book away. I would ask the presenter to recommend a book, and the next staff to comment. I would say, you won the raffle. I would give them a book. So I think it was engaging, and I didn't experience any fatigue based on the surveys that I received as it relates to our professional development.
That's great. It sounds super engaging, for sure.
I think it was. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much. We're going to invite Sharif to come on next, and Kyron will be back later for our panel discussion. Sharif, looking forward to hearing your presentation.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate REL Midwest. Again, my name is Sharif El-Mekki. I recently retired from working directly in the school. I was 26 years in 3 different schools, the last 2 being turnaround schools. I graduated high school in a public school. Many of you may have heard of Overbrook High School. Will Smith, Wilt Chamberlain, and people like that attended there in West Philly. Ended up getting a scholarship, but I went to college with the idea of being a lawyer. And it wasn't until after I graduated from college where someone spoke to me about becoming a teacher. And while I grew up in an activist family and an activist community, I did not necessarily look at education as a part of activism. Not that I crossed it off my list, it just never made it to my list. But, you know, a teacher, a Black man, Dr. Martin Ryder, was leading an effort in Philadelphia between a nonprofit called Concerned Black Men and HBCU, Cheyney University, as well as the School District of Philadelphia, to recruit Black men to become teachers. And once he pointed out the connection between racial justice and educational justice, I was eager to jump in and learn as much as possible and be an effective teacher, and ended up being a principal for the last 16 years. While I was a principal, I had an opportunity to do a fellowship at the U.S. Department of Education, and while traveling around the country and speaking and visiting schools, really noticed that there was not a lot of Black men. And I started reflecting on my own career and realized that when I was a teacher, I was the only full-time teacher that identified as a Black man. Fortunately, there were other Black men in the school who had leadership roles and maybe hybrid positions. So there were other Black men teachers, but I was the only one that was doing that full-time. And I realized that I didn't have this isolation or this invisible tax. I wasn't looked at as the disciplinarian for the school or for the grade, but that many of the people that I was meeting, many of the Black men I was meeting around the country, including in Philadelphia, did have that experience. And so launched an organization called the Fellowship Black Male Educators for Social Justice, raised enough money to hire a CEO, and then I went back to being a principal. But I was still just really intrigued of how we could address the issues in a more holistic way, and so started the Center for Black Educator Development, and really looking at four roles. One around policy: how do we advocate for policies that support educational justice? Pedagogy that's informed, that's culturally relevant, that centers the experiences of Black teachers. You know, while we hear more people speaking about Black educators, this was a cry way back in the 1880s. You know, people like Carolyn LeCount, who was a Philadelphia educator, and you know, advocated for Black principals and Black teachers in the 1880s. We also provide professional learning, workshop coaching, mentoring for professors in teacher colleges, as well as aspiring educators. And the last P that we have is pathways, where we use the Freedom Schools model to have paid apprentices, teacher apprentices. So as early as freshmen in high school, students are paired with first, second, and third graders. They're taught how to teach some basic components of reading. We work with Dr. Nell Duke out of the University of Michigan, and her research on with her doctoral student, Julia. And high school students, college students are able to work in this intergenerational model, learn how to teach first, second, and third graders, and also how to nurture and support positive racial identity, while they're also getting the same mentoring. So it's kind of lift as you climb model, where our staff is supporting the high school and college students, who in turn are supporting the first, second, and third graders. So those are our 4 pillars: policy, pedagogy, professional learning, and pipeline. And so we look at our work in professional learning in particular, that everyone, whether it's a school board member, whether it's a professor in a teacher college, whether it's the freshman in high school or a senior in college, that all educators should constantly be thinking about achievement, thinking about what is the mindset, skills, and wills necessary to be effective teachers. And so while we recruit Black and Brown teachers, we provide professional learning for everybody, because in Pennsylvania, and also as you heard in Wisconsin, the ratio, the balance is not there for as far as parity with Black students and Black teachers. And so what we recognize is that the teachers who are there, most of them are white women, that their mindset around Black children has to be developed, that they need very specific culturally responsive training that they may not necessarily get when they were in undergrad or graduate school, and now they're in a school with Black children. And when we've engaged with Black children, many of them said, I can't think about, we're recruiting them, like, hey, would you be interested in teaching? They said, I love kids, but I can't imagine coming back to a school because my experience in school has been so miserable. And so what are the ways that we can improve that outlook is for them to see themselves as part of the educational process. And so here's just a couple examples of what we use as in regard to our professional learning and addressing mindset issues. And again, this is for all educators. One, achievement. Often when people hear about achievement, they're thinking specifically about the children. But achievement also speaks to the adults who are leading classrooms in schools, their cultural competence, the critical consciousness. How are they, how do they view schools, the communities that send children, the history of public education, and how those histories and structures impact today's teaching and learning. This idea of servant leadership, cultural humility, how people show up. When we look at the data around new teachers, and where the majority of them say, I do not feel prepared to teach in urban settings or with students of color. That means that there has to be a level of humility to go and address these. And then this idea of healing. How can we all be part of restoration when a student has been harmed, when a student has gone, if the research says that Black students experience racial biases from their teachers as early as them being 3 and 4 years old, daycare and pre-K, then how is that compounded, and how as educators can we help heal them and help them with their own healing? And so these are some of the competencies. So we basically have 20 competencies altogether. These are just a couple examples of how we provide professional learning. What are we doing for workshops and coaching and mentoring? So all our professional development is really grounded in these 10 plus 10 more that speaks to what are the mindsets, how do people come across, how do they show up, And how did your own cultural lens manifest itself in lesson plans? How does it manifest in disciplinary referrals? How does it manifest in how communities are built? And so we believe that with the right mindset, people can be far more effective and student outcomes can be accelerated at significant rates if we have a level of cultural awareness, which includes far more diversity than we have now in Pennsylvania and other states around the country.
Thanks, Sharif. That sounds really interesting. I love those 10 competencies that you talked about.
Thank you. Yeah, we worked with some of the competencies from New America, but then some of them, what we were doing with our teacher apprentices, you know, freshmen in high school and college students, where you know, they are paid to do this. You know, as a principal, I had students who were interested in becoming teachers, but they were catching you know, a bus to the suburbs to flip burgers. We're like, hey, how about we raise money to pay you to work on your craft? And likewise, we would have educators who said, hey, I've actually never been, the only time I'm around Black people is when I come to the school, right? And so imagine a white person, they say, I've never been around you know, Black people, but now I'm expected to teach them and I really don't know anything about them. And I've never had the conversation. I've been in schools where people don't want to have conversations about race, class, power, and privilege, and how that all shows up in classrooms and schools. And so that work is absolutely important. The mindset is a critical foundation, and then you develop the skill and the will. But it all starts with mindset and perspective.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And does your center partner with schools? Is that how the model works?
Yes, so we partner with schools as well as districts. We are working with a group of teacher colleges in Texas. We are working with the school district in Minneapolis, who we started conversing with after the George Floyd murder. And it's all grounded again in the competencies that you see. And you know, whether it's a district or a school or IHEs, we provide coaching, workshops, you know, and all of this obviously right now is virtual.
Yeah, of course. Well, thank you so much, Sharif. That was really great and learned a lot for sure. Kyle, yep, you're coming on next to help us with the panel discussion.
Yeah, thanks, Jamila. And Sharif, if you could stay on, and I'll invite all of the other presenters back onto screen for this conversation. For those of you who are listening, if you have any additional questions for our presenters, please put them in the chat box and we'll try to get to them. And go ahead and flip to the next slide, Sarah. I'm glad we're starting with this first question, particularly after seeing the variety of roles that people are playing at different levels in the education system who are listening into this conversation. So I'm excited to hear your thoughts on this. So structural inequities, kind of those reflected in policies, resource allocations, and power dynamics, and then the personal and interpersonal biases are both complex barriers to change. And can you share some insights about confronting them at multiple levels of education? And Kyron, I think I'll start with you and then shift to Sharif, and then we can follow up with the research team.
Thank you very much. I think the main thing is just to be able to have an open and honest conversation about these barriers that exist. Often, I don't think we have the opportunity to really talk about these things. We know that they're there, but no one wants to have the discussion because we're concerned about hurting someone's feelings or someone taking it personal. But I think it just starts with having the conversation, talking about implicit bias, talk about the fact that resources aren't even distributed to maybe the south side of a district or to north side, magnet schools versus non-magnet. I think just having the conversations with an emphasis on equity and just open dialogue is going to be the solution to this issue.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. I think even as a principal, our interview questions included things about race, class, and power and privilege. You know, what does it? You know, we would ask, how do those things show up? You know, you're a white woman about to teach in a school that is, you know, 99% Black. How does that manifest? If they said, oh, no, it doesn't matter, I don't have to think about that, I don't see color, all those were red flags, because what that means is they're not recognizing the realities on the ground. They're not recognizing the lived experiences. And lived experience that they could use to help accelerate, achievement. And so that, with that being the groundwork, but I think it still has to start with leadership, how people, how principal supervisors, how district leaders start those conversations. And without that, it's really hard to do. I've consulted with organizations who, with districts where they have not spoken. They're concerned about the attrition rate of Black teachers in particular schools, but they shied away from having a direct conversation. But they're engaging me into solving a problem. I'm like, but you're not even talking about this with, sharing the data with this affected school. Like, that doesn't make sense. So you can't run away from the problem. You have to be, everyone's talking about safe spaces. We need more brave spaces in this arena.
Is it our turn to talk? Okay.
Yeah, go ahead, Curtis.
Well, I think insights into confronting at multiple levels. What we've been focused on since our reports have been released and over COVID is developing grassroots understanding of what our research is showing, and having conversations with groups, and specifically in Milwaukee, which a lot of our research is based in schools in Milwaukee, and trying to give educators the tools and the community members the tools through which to have empowered conversations with their district and hold them accountable for the effectiveness of schools that their kids are in. And so this is, we've nothing that we've reported here is as far as the inequities in school organization, as far as race inequities, is at all surprising to anybody I've ever talked about. But what we've shown is we actually have some hard numbers attached to this that show how far we are away from equity. And the groups that we've talked to can now use these reports to force school boards to have conversations with them about what they're doing for change. Because having conversations with school districts themselves has gotten us not very far.
Katie or Marlo, anything to add from your perspectives?
I'll echo a bit about Curtis's point just now about talking with grassroots organizations, particularly when considering slow or lack of response from leadership entities. I mean, when I think about ways to be able to confront structural inequities, the only ways that I've seen that have been able to result in change, or that I've experienced that have been able to result in change, are through grassroots resistance and organizing. And that can happen with, us educators and researchers, as well as with the young people that we work with and that are within the schools. Together, youth and adult organizing, the partnerships that can happen within education, the ground that is able to move, particularly when it comes to confronting structural inequities. I don't know, my experiences have shown that not necessarily effective, but it definitely is the, I guess, the go-to way of making sure that people know how you're feeling, what the reality is, and what the expectations are, right? And it's not a secret, it's open, it's out in the open, and it's out in the conversation.
Thank you. And I'm glad you all brought up open communication and open conversations, open and explicit conversations about race, anti-racism, equity. And a few of those things actually came up earlier in the webinar when we invited participants to tell us what they viewed an inclusive environment for Black teachers were. So connecting kind of the open conversations, open communication to this idea of building trust among educators and families, all the way up and through the education system. I'm wondering if you all have, based on your experience, thoughts or strategies for creating those brave spaces, as you mentioned, Sharif, and getting those conversations going.
I mean, I can start off. I think it's such an important question. I've you know, I've spoken to people, you know, from around the country. There's so many people who are very interested in recruitment. It's almost like, you know, oh, I'm out for the hunt. I'm going to look for these teachers, even if they're not really looking, even if they're just opening the door and hoping that someone comes. But what I think people need to spend a lot more time with is what are the prerequisites for a Black teacher to stay? What are the prerequisites? What are the conditions where this space is non-hostile? I think that starts off with listening. One, getting the feedback from people, whether it's from exit interviews, whether it's from people on the ground. Like, what is if we can recognize that, you know, the strains and the racial stress of growing up Black in America, being a Black person in America, we shouldn't have these naive notions that just disappears when that Black person enters a school district or a school or a classroom. So we have to recognize some of those same stressors exist within our buildings, and we have to literally humble ourselves and reflect on it, but also ask and be listeners, not to respond, but to try to understand and seek understanding. And I think getting that feedback on a consistent basis, you know, implementing the feedback loop as far as what is the experience, how do you experience being a Black person in this school, in this district? And not enough people are asking those questions. And that's the same type of question we can ask in our teacher colleges, right? Like, are Black students finishing, you know, and what is their experience being this single Black teacher in their class? Or which later on they may be the single Black teacher in their school.
Kyron, Curtis, Katie, or Marlo, anyone want to respond to that or add their thoughts?
I agree with Sharif. I think one of the most important things that I mentioned earlier is just that comprehensive needs assessment, just talking and seeing exactly what it is that people need and just recognizing the experience. I was talking with someone earlier, and I was sharing with them that for Black teachers, administrators, etc., we're constantly wearing a mask, where we have to code shift all the time, and that often isn't reality for our white colleagues. So for me, as a Black male, if I go into a room and if my voice raises, I'm aggressive, I'm intimidating, I'm threatening. My wife is an engineer. She's a female engineer. If she goes into a room and she's too quiet, then she doesn't know anything. If she's talking too much, she's the angry Black woman. So just understanding our experience that others really can't see because they're not in our shoes. Just really having that empathy and just seeing what is it that we need. Maybe people don't realize that they're perceiving us that way, but it often happens, and I see it all the time, which is why many teachers, administrators, et cetera, just feel marginalized. I talk to so many teachers that eat lunch by themselves. They've had one teacher who says she goes out to her car to eat lunch because she doesn't feel set with everyone to have lunch. So just really trying to understand the experience of what it's like to be a Black male or a Black woman.
Yeah, and I think everything that Sharif and Karan were saying was absolutely true. You know, the question is what recommendations you have for people creating inclusive and anti-racist environments for Black teachers. I mean, create them, start talking about it, start having conversations. If you're a school, start having conversations with your teachers about those topics, and start normalizing talking about these things. People aren't good at talking about it. You know, educators, everybody, we're not good at talking about these things. And like a Midwest nice doesn't go very far for addressing these issues. So we need to talk about them. We're not going to get it right, you know, the first time we talk about it. We're not going to have the right language. We need to have a safe space in every school to talk about these things and get used to doing it and being authentic with each other. And then, you know, you need direction on doing that, but it starts there. If you're not doing that, you're not doing anything.
Thanks, Curtis. And I think that transitions us to the next two questions, and maybe we can actually take them together. So in terms of kind of immediate next steps for those who are listening, I was just looking through the chat box, and there's some interest in learning more about Grow Your Own programs, or there were there was a couple other things. The role of leadership, state agency leadership, district leadership. When you think of next steps, kind of what would you what would you recommend? And what are some of the challenges that we may face in those next steps? And if you have any recommendations or experience about how to address those challenges.
Well, I'll jump in. I think, you know, I was glad to see people mention Grow Your Own, paraprofessionals. I think one of the things that we did in Pennsylvania was really kind of draw a pipeline. Research for Action had, you know, actually used a pipeline as this analogy and drew a picture and all the exit points. And so, you know, when we look at, you know, the experiences that Black children are having in school, that needs to be addressed. College and career readiness, whether they're finishing college, you know, all of that were, you know, were the normal things. But one of the things that people hadn't looked at were the tens of thousands of people in Philadelphia and across the state who started, Black and brown people who started college but didn't finish. That's a huge group of folks that are rarely engaged about, you know, and we talked, someone that asked about the state agencies, you know, what are their ways that there could be coalitions within a state or within a region to support people who started school. Maybe they got to their sophomore, junior year in life circumstances, they ran out of money or whatever, and they couldn't finish. What percentage of them may be interested if they got support to enter a school, you know, and look at teaching as a career? They would be career changers, but they also need to finish school. So that level of support. And I think, you know, as far as the question of like, what do we anticipate facing? One of the things that makes me nervous are two things. One, if we're successful in recruiting more Black teachers, but none of the other conditions for teaching and learning are addressed, and so then the Black people become the scapegoat all over again. We already have a tendency in the education field to blame children and communities. And so now we're like, oh, we got more, we're not going to address equitable funding, we're not going to address you know, asbestos, lead, disengagement, any of that. And we're just gonna say, oh, just throw more Black people at the problem instead of fixing the root, right? And sometimes when I look at educational justice, it's this tree. And instead of people addressing the roots, they're happy and content to prune the branches and say, oh, we addressed the problem. No, you have to address the roots. The other piece that I'm concerned about that is a little bit of success, people will get satisfied, and you can't be hungry and satisfied at the same time. In Philadelphia, 40% of the classroom teachers used to be Black. People are just like, oh, it's fine. Today, that number is 24% because it wasn't tended to, it was ignored, and it was assumed that everything was okay. People have to tend to the work all the way through the end and not get disengaged from it at all. So those will be some of my concerns.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
That's okay.
Oh, I think that we need to take a careful look at reevaluating the teacher certification process. Someone mentioned in the chat, there are a number of paraprofessionals, instructional assistants, et cetera, who will be phenomenal teachers. However, they do not have the financial means, nor do they want to take a year off to do an internship to become a teacher. I wonder if we could start offering more provisional certificates, look into some funding to assist people with tuition. I've ran into quite a few phenomenal assistant teachers who could become teachers, but just don't have the funding. So I think that's an option that we really need to consider if we really want to look at increasing the pool and encouraging Black teachers to enter into the field.
Katie?
I was just gonna elaborate a little bit on, I think, what's been shared. And to Sharif's point, just say, like, just focusing on recruitment, it's not enough. I know that what we've talked a lot about is the culture of the school. The other aspect is for the teachers. If we're not changing the culture of the school and we're asking these new teachers to enter a hostile environment, there's, you know, that seems ethically wrong. And then also just thinking again about the, if we're not changing the culture of the environment, and so we have an environment that our data is showing that teachers are leaving in 2 years or less, then think about the students that are left in that building who don't have that option. And, you know, what are they experiencing on a daily basis? So just sort of elaborating on the point of recruitment's not enough, that it has to also focus on the culture aspect.
And one thing I guess I'd like to point out with this is that if you think about Wisconsin, for instance, you've got 95% of its teachers are white. The achievement gap between Black and white students lays a lot more at the feet of the instruction and the abilities of white teachers to teach Black students than it does for the fact that we don't have enough Black teachers. You know, we're a long way away from having enough Black teachers. We should do that, but we need to work. You know, we need to work with our white teachers so that they don't blame parents, they don't blame students, you know, for a behavior problem, and they don't interpret, you know, just regular behavior as a behavior problem, and you know, that to me, I think this is obviously really important, but before we can get there, we're not going to get there for a while. We need to make sure we don't lose the current generation of Black students and work with our white educators so that they understand their own bias. And then part of that process would mean, in a way, if we do that well, then we're creating an environment where Black educators might actually want to be, or Black individuals might actually want to be educators, you know, as a natural process. You know, students will graduate high school and will have good, you know, will have better experiences with their teachers, and they won't look at this as something that they don't want to do, or as many. So, you know, we have to kind of go to the root of it, where we have our current students, if we ultimately want to have enough Black educators to serve the next generation of students.
I think another thing in terms of serving the next generation of students, one of the things we run into in Wisconsin a lot too is that equity work is only for the districts that serve predominantly students of color. We have several large districts, and that's where predominantly the students of color attend. And then we have a lot of predominantly white rural districts. And we find a lot of hesitancy or even just outright pushback from some of those districts that that's not their work. And I think the other thing to focus on is that this isn't just for schools serving students of color. It's good for all schools and all students. All students benefit from having educators of color, and also focusing on equity even in 100% white schools is good for future generations, because we have to disrupt the perpetuation of ongoing systems of oppression. And that has to start by having the conversations with white students as well. So I just want to make sure that we also put that out there.
Yeah, thank you, Katie, for that. And there's been some chat around culture and climate. I think that's important in all of our classrooms, in all of our schools, and all of our workplaces. Sharif, I'm wondering if you can expand on some of the things you mentioned in the chat box as well.
Oh yeah, I mean, people are making so many good points. I'm kind of responding.
Yeah. No, thank you.
I don't know which one to really chime in on, but what I would say is the students that we've worked with, you know, so we would have this Why I Teach tour, and we'd visit high schools to speak to students to see if they were interested in teaching. Some of them said, yeah, like I've always wanted to, but I didn't know how. You know, I babysit, but that's not teaching. And so what we wanted to do was create a program where they have a paid apprenticeship. There were always students who would say, my experience is so problematic, I'm so miserable. Even if I like the idea of teaching, I can't imagine coming back to a school. Chris Emden described it as returning to the scene of a crime, you know, that was committed against yourself. That's the feeling that a lot of Black children have returning to schools. And so what we would do is speak to them about consider two things. One, well, actually three, and it seemed to work because 100% of the students that we work with say that they want to teach Black children, and 90-something%, if they became teachers, 90-something% said they are more interested in becoming teachers than after our training program, than they did before. The three things are: one, consider becoming a teacher you wish you had and knew you needed. Two, if you had a miserable experience, your younger sibling, your younger neighbor, your own children may be in that very seat, and you may be able to change it. You may have a hand at impacting it. And then the third one, which seemed to be extremely powerful for them, was the same thing that attracted me to become a teacher, was connecting racial justice, social justice, and educational justice. many of our youth are activists. They are, vocal about what is just, what is fair. And when I think sometimes as educators, we try to protect them from, the issues around funding. They know in general, yeah, we don't get the same money, but not the details, right? And so making sure that part of their education is seeing all the patterns, the history of education, and then them realizing that they could be a part of addressing it, and being an educator activist really seem to, inspire and resonate with them. And we found, this is our third year having a teacher apprenticeship, which is national. We have students all around the country, and they've been doing a phenomenal job. And they also experience self-efficacy because they actually experience students getting better, so they say, oh, this child learned this skill, this reading skill, and I'm a sophomore in high school and I taught them that, right? What better way to help a student envision themselves as a leader of a classroom?
Thank you. And we're going to have to move on shortly, but Kyron, I want to give you the opportunity to have the last word as part of this panel discussion.
I just think that positive culture and climate is at the foundation of academic achievement. And I've said that plenty of times. Many people don't agree. I know we constantly push making AYP academics, but when we're dealing with kids who may have got kicked out of the house last night because mom got into a fight with boyfriend, or kids that don't have food and have other issues related to mental health, we have to deal with culture and climate and making sure that our kids and families are meeting Maslow's hierarchy of needs before we can ever start to think about academics. So that would be the thought I would like to leave with. Just continue to focus on culture and climate and the mental health and social emotional well-being of our children and families.
Thank you, Kyron. I really appreciate this conversation. I'm going to thank you all again in a few slides, but a huge thanks for sharing your expertise with us right now. I'd encourage you all to continue to use the chat box if you have any quick follow-up questions for our presenters, and I'll invite them to respond there. All right, so go ahead. In addition to this webinar, REL Midwest also produced a short video on this same topic called Creating Inclusive Workplaces for Black Teachers. And we are going to get the world premiere, pretty much, a live preview of this video. So I'm gonna let Sarah cue it, and we'll watch about the first 30 seconds.
So if we believe that cultural differences are to be celebrated and embraced, well, then that shows up as we develop curriculum. It shows up as we invite stakeholders. It shows up as we set policy. It shows up in every facet of what we do. We need to recenter our thinking on creating both value for cultural differences in education and for the belief that all students can achieve.
Great, thanks, Sarah. So the link to this video is in the chat box. It is live. It's about 10 minutes, and we really hope that this can be a tool for starting some of those conversations that can often be challenging to start. Curtis makes an appearance in this, and we also highlight a few other practitioners who talk about their experiences, particularly in the Evanston School District here in Illinois, where I am. We're also developing a viewing guide to go along with that video, again, to offer prompts and discussion ideas to go along with that video. So that will be available soon. In the spirit of continuous improvement, we please ask you to fill out a short survey that we use to inform future events just like this. The link is in the chat box, there it is. So we really do take this feedback to heart and really try to create events that are meaningful and actionable for you all. So we appreciate your feedback. It will also pop up right when the Zoom window closes if you don't quite get to the link. And we'd love to stay in touch. You can follow us on Twitter. You can sign up for our newsletters. Sarah's email here is if you would like a certificate of participation for this webinar. And then Jamila and my emails are on the next slide. And we're always welcome to keep these conversations going offline. So please join me in thanking our presenters, Curtis, Katie, and Marlo, as well as Kyron and Sharif. Again, we really appreciate you sharing your knowledge and expertise with us today. And from Jamila and myself, thank you for joining us. and we hope to hear from you soon. Take care.